What began as competition over the lucrative fur trade rapidly escalated into sustained, bloody campaigns waged by the Iroquois Confederacy against neighboring tribes and European rivals alike. Over decades, the Five Nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, leveraged firearms, strategic alliances, and brutal warfare tactics to dismantle powerful confederacies. The Mohicans, Huron, Neutral, Erie, Susquehannock, and various northern Algonquins. Today, many scholars frame these events as genocidal in character, for the deliberate pursuit of annihilation and displacement rather than mere plunder. Yet by mid-century, the Iroquois juggernaut began to stall. The English seizure of New Netherland in 1664 severed crucial Dutch ties. French overtures failed to sway the Iroquois League, and in the mid-18th century, the Franco-Indian struggle saw the covenant chain between New York and the Five Nations propel an Anglo-Iroquois coalition that expelled France from Canada. By war's end, the Iroquois had carved an empire of fear across the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, yet their demographic and military primacy had begun to wane. The Beaver Wars thus paved the way for English colonial dominance in North America and set a bloody precedent for indigenous European relations to follow. Hello, and welcome to Deadliest Disasters. In the early 17th century, European demand for beaver pelts ignited a frenzy across eastern North America. Fashionable hat makers in Paris and London endowed beaver felt with near mythical status, and traders scoured forests for the prized pelts. For indigenous nations, pelts became a way to procure axes, firearms, cloth, and other European luxuries. Yet access to coastal ports, and thus European goods, depended on strategic alliances. The French cultivated the Huron Confederacy around the upper Great Lakes. The Dutch entrenched themselves in New Netherland, trading chiefly with the Mohawk and other Iroquois tribes. New Netherlands was Dutch-controlled land in what became the states of New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Connecticut, with small outposts in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island. New Amsterdam was the capital of their colonial government in what is now modern-day Manhattan. Long before European ships charted inland waterways, tribal confederacies of the Huron, Neutral, Erie, Susquehannock, Algonquin, and Mohican had forged trade networks and diplomatic marriages. Intertribal warfare was often ceremonial, directed at captives for adoption and integration rather than killing, but the fur trade altered incentives. Access to firearms and metal tools heightened the stakes. Controlling the beaver-rich hinterlands meant economic and military supremacy. By the 1620s, beaver populations around the lower Great Lakes were decimated, propelling tribes westward. The Iroquois in particular recognized that controlling the flow of pelts would guarantee their rise to power. The Iroquois sought to monopolize the fur trade by dominating neighboring tribes and seizing their hunting grounds. Each raised village delivered captives for adoption and beaver pelts for trade. By neutralizing or co-opting rival confederacies, the Iroquois protected their western flank from potential French incursions. Ceremonial wars, known as mourning wars, originally aimed at replacing lost tribe members through captive adoption, but this morphed into campaigns of extermination, a chilling testament to how European arms warped traditional norms. Between 1640 and 1650, a series of relentless campaigns, the so-called Beaver Wars, swept through the region. Villages were surrounded at dawn, men, women, and children massacred or dragged away screaming, long houses torched. Those who miraculously survived fled west, sowing fear and chaos. The Iroquois Confederacy's sophisticated political structure held a ground council at Onondaga with representatives from each nation. This allowed coordinated, large-scale war parties rarely seen among neighboring tribes. Typical war parties numbered in the hundreds with scouts, war chiefs, and medicine men. They moved swiftly on snowshoes in the winter and birch bark canoes in the spring and summer, striking with precision and psychological terror. With Dutch firearms in hand, Iroquois warriors unleashed shockingly effective volleys, often slaughtering fighting-aged men and non-combatants alike. Villages were encircled, thatched roofs were set ablaze, forcing inhabitants into the open where they were easily mowed down. Surviving captives faced grotesque mutilations, flesh seared with red-hot irons, fingers and toes sliced off, ribs torn out. The Iroquois intended to instill lasting dread and a reputation for brutality. French Jesuit missionaries recoiled in horror. In 1649, Father Joseph Le Caron wrote of one Huron village, quote, "Swept away at sunrise, children and elders roasted alive in their own homes," unquote. Such accounts spurred some historians to label the Beaver Wars genocidal, designed not merely to gain trade partners, but to eradicate rival peoples and erase their history forever. By the year 1649, after years of intermittent skirmishes and famine, the Huron homelands around Georgian Bay lay defenseless. A coalition of Iroquois war parties descended into winter, looting food stores, massacring survivors, and driving women and children into slavery. Fewer than 1,000 Huron remained. The neutral tribe attempted peace between French and Dutch, but in the year 1653, a rumor had spread of their collusion with the French. This sealed their fate, and thousands perished as the Iroquois set fire to their villages. Not one building was spared as the Iroquois massacred the survivors. The Erie, split between allegiances, suffered a similar fate, and by the year 1656, their towns lay empty. Many men were killed, and the survivors of the Erie tribe were later absorbed into Seneca communities. Along New York's Hudson Valley, the Mohicans resisted initial Iroquois advances but were eventually overcome in 1663. Their survivors migrated north along the Hudson. Some later joined the Wapinger or the Stockbridge Mohican community. The Susquehannock, once dominant in the Susquehanna Valley, faced a coordinated Iroquois siege in 1675. Their last village was besieged, prompting mass starvation and surrender. Bands of Algonquin hunters retreated toward the Montreal hinterlands, but Iroquois raids in 1660s and 1670s kept them on the defensive, forcing many to cling to French protection. By the late 1660s, the Iroquois reigned supreme from Lake Ontario to the Ohio Valley, but their prize carried unforeseen burdens. In 1664, England seized New Netherland, renaming New Amsterdam as New York and Fort Amsterdam as Fort James. The Iroquois had lost their most reliable source of firearms, gunpowder, and iron tools. English governors proved less accommodating than the Dutch. Trade restrictions tightened, and bribery replaced the open gifts once lavished at council meetings. Meanwhile, the French dispatched missionaries, traders, and soldiers to entice the Iroquois' Five Nations. They offered gunboats on Lake Ontario, blankets, and promises of military aid against English colonies. Yet the Iroquois, ever pragmatic, refused to abandon the English link. They calculated that playing the two European powers against one another offered the best chance to secure goods and maintain autonomy. This decision, however, came at a cost. Embittered French, Huron, and Algonquin raids forced the Iroquois onto the defensive by the 1680s. While they still conducted punitive expeditions, they now faced counter raids into Mohawk Valley and the Genesee country. By the 1730s, New York's colonial governors formalized what is known as the Covenant Chain, or a diplomatic alliance in which the Iroquois pledged support to the crown in exchange for trade privileges, annual gifts, and political recognition. When tensions flared between Britain and France over the Ohio Valley, the Iroquois Confederacy, now known as the Six Nations, sided decisively with the English. From 1754 to 1763, in the inferno known as the French and Indian War, Iroquois warriors served as scouts, raiders, and diplomatic intermediaries for the English. Their intimate knowledge of terrain proved invaluable during the siege of Fort Niagara and the capture of Fort Duquesne, later named Fort Pittsburgh. By war's end, France had ceded eastern Canada to Britain. Yet the ongoing violence of the Beaver Wars had left the Six Nations demographically diminished, their warriors fewer, younger, and less experienced. Meanwhile, English settlers poured into the lands without any trepidation, laying farms and claiming territory. The Beaver Wars had forever reshaped eastern North America. Indigenous power corridors fractured. The Iroquois carved out the middle ground, but could not hold wave upon wave of colonial migrants. The brutality and displacement of entire populations, led by the Iroquois, Dutch, and English, set a grim model for later Indian wars, removal policies, and settler colonial expansion. Survivors of Huron, Erie, and Susquehannock tribes carried memories of torture and massacre into French and English churches. This helped fuel decades of frontier animosity. By the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Britain stood completely unchallenged in North America, yet the fruits of Iroquois conquest had already begun to wither. The Six Nations entered uneasy peace with colonial governments, even as squatters pressed into their western hunting grounds. Their power and control began to wane into obscurity. The Beaver Wars were more than a series of frontier raids. They were a seismic collision of economies, cultures, and technologies. From the Huron fields on Georgian Bay to the Susquehanna timberlands, villages burned, captives writhed in torture, and survivors fled westward in terror. The Iroquois Confederacy, armed with Dutch steel and driven by strategic vision, exacted a reign of terror so brutal that historians now consider it genocidal. Yet the same currents that buoyed Iroquois power, the fur trade, European arms, diplomatic savvy, also carried the seeds of its decline. The English takeover of New Netherland, the failure of French courtship, and the relentless tide of Anglo-American settlers foreshadowed a new era. By 1763, the colonial map had been redrawn. British dominion replaced the old balance of power. In this crucible of violence and commerce, the foundations were laid for the British and later American colonization of the continent. The Beaver Wars remind us that early North America was no Edenic frontier, but instead a cauldron of competing interest and existential struggles. The echoes of murder and torture still reverberate in the scars on the land and the memories of indigenous peoples who survived the fires of war. In understanding this history, we confront not only the complexities of colonial encounter, but the human capacity for both brutality and resilience. Thank you all for tuning in. Please like and subscribe, and let me know what other topics you'd like me to cover. This has been Deadliest Disasters.